I actually went to a Free Baba Ahmed protest outside one of the courts. It was quite a fairly large one, and I went because I thought next it could be my brother, and then it was him. My brother was there too.
5 years ago, they brought me to a cell. And ever since, a waiting game plays here, as they decide on sending me away. My parents grow so grey and sad at home. How will they manage visiting me there? Or must they wait until the end of time? Ma, hear my oath. By him whose hand is time, bars stand in worship with me in this cell. So even if I'm extradited there, and taken from my humble parents' home, tell them paradise is our true home, whose gardens years will never fade away. The poems I just read were by Sayyid Talha Ehsan. He's an individual who was a prominent campaigner a few years ago, especially campaigning for the rights of people like Mohsen Beg, who were detained without trial in Guantanamo Bay. And as part of his campaign work, it seemed that he'd been arrested and put into detention within England without trial, and has remained so for over 5 years now. Perhaps they'll clean their hands of me once there, and then my country feels I'm wiped away.
Quite a distressing and humiliating experience. I was just lying in my bed and, police officers come in my house and I had to get undressed in front of them, and they go for every corner of my room and take photographs of every corner of my room. I was just a lazy student. And bizarrely, they asked questions like, do you have any Qurans in the room? And it was just strange. I just thought it felt a bit like a movie or what you hear about so-called police states. I just found it bizarre. And by all at an American request, this search warrant, it wasn't anything to do with British law. So it's funny how a foreign country could just come and invade my house like that.
When this house is searched, the 15 and 20 police officers came in this house, and they came at about 9 and finished at about 12 in the night. They had an intention, if anything is suspicious or if he get anything, then they will arrest it. But they could not find anything out. So each and every corner, from top to bottom,
The case began in the courts in the United Kingdom, and within those courts it was a matter of raising the arguments, the relatively limited number of arguments that exist to suggest that extradition to the United States would be wrong. But as the case has developed, a number of factors have become far clearer than they were originally. And the case is now, and has been for 4 years, before the European Court of Human Rights, which has and is preventing the United Kingdom from sending either of the men to the United States, while it considers whether to send them there would violate the prohibition on subjecting anyone to torture or cruel and inhuman treatment.
At 5 o'clock in the morning, the anti-terrorist police, they broke into his house of them, and they pulled him out of his bed and dragged him and tortured him, beat him, and taken him to the police station, all the way beating him up, face down, punching and kicking. And at one time he thought that he was going to die.
Pretty extraordinary what happened to Babar Ahmed at his arrest. There is a perception nowadays that what happened in the bad old days when Irish defendants were beaten up to make false confessions, that those times have gone, and there's far more monitoring of what happens in police stations. But this was a savage assault upon a defenceless man. And there was something going on there in the psyche of that search team, where they have been hyped up to believe, first of all, that this was an extremely dangerous person who was likely to be being caught in the middle of preparing for some extraordinary attack. But also, it had been done for a purpose. We've seen the briefing now. Because Babar brought a successful civil action, there had to be disclosure of documents. We've seen the briefing. It was extraordinary. It was hyped up. It was like activating attack dogs. Why? Something very odd there. Who psyched up whom and why? Part of it is obviously on the basis of utterly false information. So where did it come from? Did it come from torture somewhere? Did it? It was happening in the end of '03, and you have to bear in mind that there were people Babar knew who were in Guantanamo, or were being held in prisons in Afghanistan, in Bagram. People he knew and was close to. So where did all this come from? It's very disturbing entry into the case, let alone how it continued.
The scars that he got, the physical scars may have gone, but the mental scars will stay with him for the rest of his life.
Theresa May, a minister at home, though feeble servant to her masters there, A solitary torture chamber cell to put me in, she'll simply say, away. So let me, while I can, devote my time to work for my own justice over here.
The context of the 2003 Extradition Act is essentially part of a very lopsided relationship between the United States of America and the rest of the world, and the United States of America, and particularly the UK. Post 9/11, the sort of disparity between the two in terms of geopolitical power was very much emphasised, and the United States, carrying with it this kind of momentum after 9/11, was able to really extract from its partners, if you like, in the kind of Western alliance or whatever you want to call it, all sorts of really quite outrageous concessions. Now, the Extradition Act has a lot of inbuilt injustice with regard to the relationship between two sovereign states. Forget about, you know, any racism or Islamophobia in it. And part of that injustice and imbalance is the fact that whilst the UK, should it wish to have somebody extradited to the UK, would need to provide all sorts of evidence of the charges, give what charges they were wanted on, and then provide evidence for them and submit them to relevant authorities in the US. No such criteria is required in reverse. Literally, the US snaps its fingers and says, we want X, and the UK has to send them. And this is where we're at. Nearly a decade later, actually 9 years later, in the United Kingdom, with several people waiting for extradition to the United States, and yet, you know, had they been guilty of a crime, they could have been charged in the United Kingdom. Really sufficient evidence, nothing with regard to what they're wanted for in detail is being provided from the other side. And many of them have spent years incarcerated, waiting to have appeals heard and so on, and trying to sort of fight this, the injustices of this act through the courts in the United Kingdom. Their lives, their youth in many cases being wasted away.
And as the investigations have developed, it has become more and more clear that what America does to its prisoners is shocking beyond belief. In particular, the way in which it uses solitary confinement, extreme isolation, ostensibly as a security measure, but in fact to break the will and the spirit and the body of the prisoner. And so the evidence that we have been able to obtain with the help of those few American lawyers who fight the battle there is that if they were extradited to America, both of them would immediately go into solitary confinement. Now, in prison here, that's bad enough, being in prison, but they would be in a cell, remain in a cell, not go out of the cell, not see anyone, not communicate with anybody save their lawyer until the trial. And that could last for 3 years on remand. And the successive evidence that we have is that those people who face that form of pretrial detention effectively go mad. They don't do justice to themselves in any way.
It's a shame. I mean, it's what it's done to the family. It's I wouldn't wish that on anybody. It's a permanent grief that embalms that home now. You know, so there's no respite for any member of that family. No respite at all, and there's incredible strength demonstrated by them, by the father, by the mother, by Hamza. Oh, that's not the pot of gold. That's not the silver lining. That's not to be. That's not a sweetener in any way. The fact that they're remaining strong. Their strength is a mark of their dignity, but the fact is that as a British citizen, first and foremost, all of us should be concerned about this case, because this is a British citizen we're talking about, for whom the British law doesn't apply. We have to ask why.
There's no normality in the life of anyone connected with it. Everyone's life is on hold. Everyone's life proceeds in the fear that even worse is going to happen. If Baba or tell her, go to America, get locked up for life in isolation, that to everybody is the end. And so we never get to the end of the beginning. And Europe has taken 4 years, and it's very hard on everybody.
Even to this day, it all feels very unreal. It's just by basic logic, you know, why is he being held by a country he's never been to in a British prison? You know, it's sometimes even the reality of things just doesn't. Maybe because it's so traumatic, it just doesn't sink in. You just have to be hopeful and think he will be released, and because sometimes he describes solitary confinement in America and conditions of prison and supermax, and I just feel so disturbed by the descriptions, and I just go home feeling quite hurt and sad. And
we were a very, very happy family, but since Talha gone, we all are more or less sick, we are depressed, we are unhappy. So, and we always pray to Allah so that Talha can come back to us.
Of course, when we went to see him in the prison, that was terrible. And when slowly we got used to it, and then we were, you know, then we felt a bit strong, and then we gave him strength. And he's very calm, quiet type of a boy, and he used to, and still does, give strength to us. He said, please, and sometimes he would say to his mother, if you cry on the telephone, I won't talk to you, and I don't want to give the impression that I'm cracking.
you know, it sometimes causes me nightmares, actually. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd have a nightmare of my brother in solitary confinement or being tortured, and it affects me quite badly, actually. It's affecting my, you know, I'd have to take time off school, and I'd find it hard to work, and it sometimes made me feel quite, I tried to stay strong, but it's like the world's greatest superpower versus, you know, a rather frail Asian family.
We are affected very much. It's very, very difficult to explain, because we are a family. So if one person gone, so the family is not full.
There are many interesting disparages and the kind of discrimination when it comes to not so much even the implementation of the Extradition Act, but the way it's perceived is really immense. You will see, for example, somebody like Gary McKinnon, who is also a victim of this law, who has Asperger's syndrome, who, if extradited, faces sort of imprisonment in a high security prison, possibly for the rest of his life. You know, we're talking about sort of, I don't know, decades being given as a sentence for a computer hacking charge. At the same time, you have someone like Talha Hassan, whose story is very similar in many ways. You know, the fact that he has Asperger's syndrome is impactful on what it is he's being accused of doing. And yet the way he is perceived in the media, insofar as he is perceived even in the mainstream, and that's really very rarely, if at all, is markedly different. So even the way campaigners and the general public see people who are victims of this act is indicative of the kind of climate that we're living in. People are not really feeling sorry for Talha Hassan because he has Asperger's syndrome and is a victim of an unjust law. They kind of tend to be going with the, well, there's no smoke without fire. He must have done something.
But, you know, Gary McKinnon's not Muslim, and he's white, and So maybe he's seen, when Daily Mail says British justice for British citizens, maybe they have a more idea of what that is and what that excludes. I've put some of Dullah's poetry in my exhibitions actually on the walls, and we also put it in the Islam Expo exhibition. I've often actually seen people cry in front of the poem, you know, which goes about faith in prison. Even Bruce Kent, who's a Catholic, you know, he just said this is the most moving poem about faith in prison.
I think this poem is about the awareness of the presence of God, and I just think there are very few people in any faith who can communicate as powerfully as this poem does.
A prisoner, on his knees, scrubs around a toilet bowl, and the bristles of the brush scuttle to and fro as a guard swaggers over to yell rather than ask, "Where is your God now?" And the prisoner, still on his knees, his brush still cleaning, answers, "He's with me now, Gov. My God is with me now, hearing and seeing, whilst your superiors, when they see you, do not look at you, and when they hear you, do not listen to you. My God is risen above the heavens and closer to me than my jugular vein, whilst your superiors, no different to you, allow you no further than the desk. My God wants me to call him, whilst your superiors demand you knock. And when I go towards him a handspan, he comes to me a yard. And when I go to him walking, he comes to me running.
I feel very proud of his writing and work. It shows his sort of humanity and sensitivity, and you know, media is always trying to demonise and dehumanise what are victims of the war on terror campaign. And if you read it, you can just see how other side.
I would be unbelievably disappointed if the European Court of Human Rights says that it is fine to send any human being to the conditions that they would face in America, and it would send out a bad message to the rest of the world to think that Europe says this is okay. I don't know. There is a new factor now that we only just have found out, and that is the way in which the police manipulated the evidence so that the prosecution here didn't see it. So this is a new round of fighting, and to say to the prosecution here, look at it, just look at it, have another look and see where they should be tried.
We never gave up hope, and we are quite positive. And he also said that no, one day I will come and everything will be fine. And we can only hope, and try we must. And we have been doing our very best. And I said to Baba, I said, I have to go to any corner of the world, if I have to do anything to help you, I'll do that. If you ask me to go at 12 o'clock at night to go to this meeting or that meeting or this conference, that conference, I'll do that.
Neither of them should be in prison. Both of them are damaged. Baba is traumatised by what happened to him at the hands of the police. Talha is a vulnerable individual, just like Gary McKinnon. He can barely survive in what are more benign conditions in Long Lartin in Worcestershire. How either of them would cope in extreme isolation in America? Well, it's a rhetorical question. They wouldn't. They wouldn't.
Even if we were united, I think we'd still have problems. It's still, even the most hopeful scenario is, and it's the way 5 years of prison would have affected my brother's sense of well-being and his mental state and his sense of hope, and it'd be difficult being employed and married, and so there'll be another set of, but that's, you know, to stay hopeful.
I hope that Allah gives me enough strength that when he comes out, I'm able to greet him smiling.